After years of following her political powerhouse husband around, Mary Curzon's health took a nosedive, but after a tragic near-death experience, her husband abandoned her, and her response was unbelievable. Mary was born Mary Victoria Later in 1870 to one of the wealthiest families in Chicago. From a young age, immense pressure was put on Mary to be perfect, prim, and presentable. Even though the Laters were already influential around Chicago, Mary's mother harbored dreams of even greater social success, especially if her daughter could catch a high-ranking husband. And she went to great lengths to make sure it would happen. From her adolescence onward, one thing was clear about Mary. She was an oddly captivating beauty. As one admirer put it, she was serious and earnest rather than scintillating. But this earnestness was its own charm, especially when combined with her oval face, pale skin, and dark hair. It wasn't long before the men in her circles began to take notice. Like all well-to-do families of the time, the Laters spent a great deal of time in Europe, particularly in the fashionable city of Paris, and often took Mary along to better expose their daughter to culture and introduce her to society. While on one trip there, she caught the eye of a man named Edward Morel, who immediately began courting her. As Edward apparently had no aristocratic title to his name, he was really only a test run for Mary's family to marry her off, and they were now ready to play the game for real. When Mary made her official debut, jaws dropped. Slender and tall, reports put her at somewhere around 5'8". She appeared to float into ballrooms with her impeccable posture. In this way, she caught a particularly big fish. During this time, somewhere in the flurry of balls and luncheons, Mary made fast friends with 23-year-old Frances Cleveland, a married society lady several years older than her. But it was who Frances was married to that set tongues wagging, none other than Grover Cleveland, the current President of the United States. It was a social coup for Mary, and they kept on coming. After nabbing the First Lady of the United States as a close personal friend, Mary continued her charm offensive on society. McAllister Ward, confidant of Caroline Astor, the ultimate doyenne of New York City society, anointed Mary as one of his favorites and even invited her to the next installment of the exclusive Patriarch Ball. Not that Mary let this get to her head. Throughout this, Mary remained almost stubbornly, unnaturally humble about her meteoric rise in society. At one ball, a man whisked her away from a young woman who had been desperate for a dance. Mary spent her time with him, explaining that he should have asked the other girl instead of her, which he promptly did. Then again, some might have seen this behavior as sanctimonious pity, and they would be none too happy about the next event in Mary's life. By now, Mary was the toast of any town she entered, and men and her mother were salivating at the thought of making her a wife. For a long while, however, Mary resisted these plots, happily enjoying her freedom and flirtation. Until, that is, a man came along that neither Mary nor her family could resist. Mary met George Curzon, the eldest son of a baron and a prominent member of the British Parliament, at one of the endless balls she went to, but this time it was different. Mary was immediately love-struck by him, and he would later say he had never seen Mary light up more than at the moment when he saw her walk into the great assembly. But the course of true love never did run smooth, and Mary was about to learn the hard way. The next few days passed in a haze for the would-be lovers. They met again at an acquaintance's impressive English manor house, and when they took a walk in a private garden, George later admitted he had a strong inclination to kiss Mary and had to struggle mightily with the strict propriety of the age not to do just that. Soon they were exchanging fevered letters and trinkets, yet, in truth, Mary should have been on her guard. Even during this time, George Curzon was hiding a painful secret. Thanks to the incorrect curvature of his spine, he suffered from debilitating agonies. In order to mitigate it, he wore a steel corset with leather padding, but still had difficulty riding or standing for long periods. This, naturally, often made his temper short, but there was a lot more going on than just back pain. No man had ever captured Mary's attention like George Curzon, but red flags were obvious from the start. For one, he was 11 years older than her, and thus in his 30s, while she was just beginning her 20s. For another, he was a sharp, even severe and ambitious man who worked himself to the bone, and who was often away on parliamentary engagements. Only that wasn't all. It wasn't just that George was a somewhat harsh and busy man. He was far more experienced than Mary in matters of romance. Women had always been attracted to him, but that wasn't the most unsettling part. He had also gained a reputation for waylaying society girls in corridors, woods, and trains. For all George's exclamations of love at first sight, then Mary was in dangerous waters. Instead of a swift fairy tale, Mary got a frustrating, painful wait. George continued his work and his travels, and his emotions about Mary seemed to wane over the next few months as he concentrated on British business. Meanwhile, all Mary's family could see she was pining away, but Mary knew what she wanted, and she wasn't about to let it go. 3 years passed since Mary's first meeting with George, and she showed her devotion in increasingly insistent ways. Although she had plenty of suitors, she always rejected them, knowing that now she had met George Curzon, no man would ever match him as a husband. Then she went one step further. Eventually, able to wait no longer, Mary organized a meeting with George, finally back from one of his trips, and she confessed everything. She held nothing back and essentially told him it was him or no one. His response was almost everything she hoped for. George, his passions inflamed once again, told her he felt the same way, yet there were roadblocks still in their way. Although Mary was once more at the top of George's mind, he had one fear. He was still due to make several long trips in the coming year or more, and he didn't think it was appropriate to do these voyages while married with a wife at home. Even so, they were young and in love. That's when they made a scandalous plan. In the face of these difficulties, Mary and George agreed to become engaged in total secrecy, though even this had strings attached. The engagement was, George wrote, on the understanding that I should be at liberty to complete my tasks before we took the final step. Meanwhile, Mary pledged that if George didn't make it back from his travels, she would never marry. In a trend that would follow them for the rest of their lives, George was surely getting the better end of the deal. In fact, that was his intention. In George Curzon, Mary was connecting herself with an eminently respectable, intelligent man whom she clearly adored, but her love came with a high price. George explicitly expected Mary to always take a back seat to him, as he once said, "Give me a girl who knows a woman's place and does not yearn for trousers. Give me, in fact, Mary." Mary, for her part, was happy to concede, but she would pay for it. As romantic as their secret engagement appeared to Mary and George, it was also an agonizing prospect. They had already had a long-distance courtship before their engagement, and they now entered 2 years with almost no contact with each other. By the eve of their wedding, they had met for just 2 days and a handful of hours. Nonetheless, they slowly made their engagement public, and that wedding did come. Although the president couldn't attend George and Mary's wedding, his first lady could. The union, after all, took place just across from the White House on Lafayette Square. Mary wore lace-trimmed white satin, a glittering coronet of diamonds, and a veil that fell across her dark hair as she walked down the aisle. She was a picture-perfect bride, but she was about to realize she didn't have a picture-perfect marriage. Mary did her wifely duty and was soon pregnant after her wedding. Then it took a terrifying turn. On Christmas Eve, 1895, she began having labor symptoms, and the newlyweds were certain that the baby would come prematurely and likely perish. They had to call in a doctor quickly, and he managed to avert the crisis. Mary's eldest daughter, Mary Irene, was born several weeks later in January, though this news wasn't received with as much joy as you'd imagine. Despite the first scare, Mary was soon pregnant again. This time, the baby had little trouble, but there was another problem entirely. It was another daughter, whom they named Cynthia, and this put George Curzon in a difficult position. As a traditional man, he desperately wanted a male heir, and instead he now had two girls. If Mary expected much comfort from her husband on this matter, she was sorely mistaken. In 1898, 3 years into their marriage, George Curzon became the Viceroy of India, an extremely high-ranking position in colonial imperialist Britain. Suddenly, Mary's quiet life was torn to shreds, as she became one of the most envied and watched women in the country. "We begin to be treated like grandees," she wrote. "Station masters always meet us. Carriages are reserved." But that was just the beginning. In India, the British insisted on strict protocols around the viceroy and his vice-reign, and Mary was again exposed to painfully few people. In her day-to-day life, the people she met were either one of her husband's employees or family to these employees. At the many formal dinners, the seating rules were so rigid that she often had to sit beside the same man night after night. She may have thought India would be a good reset, but soon enough, Mary was once more deeply unhappy with the isolation and cultural differences in India. It wasn't long before both Mary and George were in bad shape in India. Mary tried in vain during George's tenure as Viceroy to curb his need to work at all times, but it was as useless as it had ever been. She also had a new problem emerging. Mary fell pregnant again. She and George planned to have her go back to England to have the child, but George's relentless ambition threw a wrench in that too. Although his term as Viceroy was up, George was insisting on a second term in India, something no Viceroy before him had ever done. Once again, it was Mary who became the victim in this. After much finagling, Mary went back to England in January 1904, while George joined her in May. Yet it was to be a brief visit. They were due back in India that September. Amidst this stress, she gave birth to yet another girl named Alexandra, though everyone they knew from India called her Baba, for Viceroy's baby. As joyous as the birth of her third daughter was for her anyway, the next few months would become the most difficult in Mary's life. Just weeks after giving birth to Alexandra, Mary suffered from a series of illnesses and one acute tragedy. She was intermittently sick and plagued with headaches, and then that summer she got pregnant again, likely always in search of that boy, but had a miscarriage quickly after. Incredibly, if unsurprisingly, none of this deterred her and George's plan to head back to India, regardless of what Mary's body was saying, but she would soon pay. Against all odds, Mary somehow pulled through from this illness, and by the beginning of the autumn, she was no longer on the brink, though she did require an intense amount of rest and steadiness. More than that, she was liable to relapse at any moment, with the illness coming on again as quickly as it had before, which made George's next decision all too heartless. Throughout Mary's long illness, George still had his position in India to think about, though he had delayed it when he thought she was dying. Now he made a chilling choice, once more putting his work above everything else, even the woman he loved. He took his post back up in India and left Mary to convalesce alone. But really, that wasn't the worst part. George Curzon likely believed that Mary would understand his duty to abandon her, and he was right. Mary didn't just accept him leaving, she took it one unbelievable step further. When she was barely able to move around and only with help, she wrote to George and told him she would join him in India shortly. It would be one of the final grand gestures in her life. Mary and George were supposed to be in India until 1906, but fate had crueler plans. After unrest, rightful protests of British rule by Indian citizens, and George's allies in Parliament turning away from him, it became clear George had to resign. He did so in the summer of 1905, and by December they were on their way back to England, tails between their legs, but it only set the stage for a bigger downfall. By the time Mary arrived back on English soil, she was more ragged than ever, and disillusioned to boot. She had given up everything for George, even her own whims, and it amounted to less than nothing. When they landed, not one government official came to meet them. Writing to her mother, she called returning to India a great mistake for both her and George, and confessed, "I shall go out of my mind if I have to bear much more strain and worry." Tragically, she couldn't bear it. Mary, never completely healed, did try to finally rest now. It was just far too late. Illness hit her again and again in 1906, with influenza making a cough that shook her bones to pieces, and other ailments causing her heart trouble. That summer she wrote to her brother, "I sometimes fear and feel I shall never be well again." And sadly, she was right. In a tragic irony, after years of illness and a prolonged near-fatal infection, when Mary's end came, it was swift and unstoppable. On July 18, 1906, after a restless night and with very little hope left to fuel her, she suffered a fatal heart attack at 6 p.m. Her husband was finally by her side. With her steadfast, even harmful devotion to George, her diligent time as a colonial vice-reine, and her serious, often melancholy temperament, Mary Curzon's legacy was nowhere near as simple as her quick end. Although Mary perished at the rock bottom of her husband's career, she would likely have been delighted to know how he powered on and succeeded without her. George would go on to both claw back his career, becoming Foreign Secretary, and to remarry to society Beauty Grace Duggan. In 1921, he even became a marquis. Thanks for watching History Exposé. If you love uncovering the best stories in history, hit like and subscribe to Keep Exploring with us. Don't forget to visit our main page, Factornade, for more incredible facts about everything.